Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Welcome to another video on the Canon R5 Mark II. This video is coming a lot quicker than I thought it would, given that it's my setup video for birds and flight for this camera. And I'll tell you, I've settled on some settings a lot quicker than I thought I would. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I've been shooting the R5 and the R3 for a long time. Very similar menu setup to those cameras, but different because there's some additional things in this camera. And so if you're interested in knowing how I set up my R5 Mark II for birds and flight, including a deep dive into the menu system, stay tuned. Hey, we're out of the field, back into my studio where, like I said in the intro to this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the setup of the Canon R5 Mark II for birds and flight. So here we go. Hey, you might want to grab a drink, maybe some popcorn, because this is going to be a longer video. A lot of things to go over. First menu. I call it the shoot menu, the red menu, and we're at the number 1 tab, JPEG, and I call it HEIF, shooting, quality. I shoot RAW, but there's some things in here that you can change. The quality of the recording for large, medium, small 1 and small 2 JPEGs and HEIF files, and maybe you shoot some of this stuff for birds in flight and you want to change some of these. I leave them pretty much the way they are because I shoot almost exclusively RAW files. So the image type and size that I'm shooting is CRAW. And in here you can use your main dial by your shutter button to change the RAW file, either no RAW file being recorded, full RAW, or I use CRAW or compressed RAW because the file sizes are so much smaller, and that helps with buffer. You don't fill your buffer as quickly, and you dump your buffer quicker. And for action type photography, birds in flight, like I like to shoot, that's really important. A note of clarification. When you go from RAW to CRAW, you are not changing the resolution of the images you're taking. It's still 45 megapixels. As you can see up at the top there, it says 45 megapixels, 8192 by 5464. And if you move over to RAW, it says the same thing. You're not changing the resolution. You're just changing the size of each picture file on your card, for example. It's the megabytes you're changing, not the megapixels. For JPEG, down below there, you can use your thumb wheel to change what you want to record there. I have it on the hyphen because I don't want to record any of those. I just want to record CRAW. That's what I have. For cropping aspect ratio, full. I don't crop in camera. I just don't. Because I don't need to get my images off to a media source or something like that real quickly while I'm in the field. I always have time to post-process. And cropping in camera is the same as cropping in post-processing. If you go over to 1.6 times crop, you are losing resolution on your image. This is not like using teleconverters. This is not like putting a 1.6 times teleconverter on your lens and camera. When you crop here, you're cropping, you're losing pixels. Same thing you do when you do it in post-processing. So again, the only time I'm going to do that is if I'm shooting JPEGs or something like that and I have to get things off while I'm in the field and I won't have time to post-process and I need that cropped composition I can get by going into the crop mode. If you go down below, if you hit the info button, the shooting area, you can either outline it or mask it. Personal preference, however you want. If you go into a cropped mode, do you want just a bar to show up on each side? Or do you want to completely mask it? Personal preference, pick whichever you like. I don't shoot crop, so it doesn't really matter to me. get out of there, moving to the next tab. Top, exposure compensation. I shoot manual exposure. I control my ISO, my shutter speed, and my aperture. And so I don't shoot exposure compensation. It's grayed out here. Why is it grayed out? Oh, ISO speed pre-continuous shooting is turned on. There's some other settings I have set up that won't let me use exposure compensation, like I'm in manual exposure and I have my ISO speed set to not auto and stuff like that. So it's grayed out at this point. But if we change those settings, it would turn on and you could use exposure compensation, but I don't do it. ISO speed settings. Hey, you can change your ISO speed. Of course, we're not doing that in a menu, generally speaking. We've got a dial set for that. I'll go over that later on when I get to my dial settings. But ISO speed range, you can limit it if you want. Your auto, when you're in auto ISO, if you only want it to go so high or so low, you can put a range in there. You can also have your minimum shutter speed set if you want. I don't do any of this stuff, again, because I want the full range of ISOs available to me, so I leave them as the default. And I don't shoot auto ISO very often, if ever, so we just leave everything as a default here. Anti-flicker shooting is grayed out. Pre-continuous shooting, you can't have anti-flickering turned on if you have your pre-shooting on, pre-capture on. Anti-flicker shooting doesn't really come into play when you're shooting birds unless you've got birds flying around in a gym somewhere with lighting that has a frequency to it. So don't really worry about these flickering, anti-flickering settings. There's also a high frequency anti-flickering if that's applicable to your birds and bird in flight photography. Don't see how it ever could be. External speed light control, these kinds of things. If you're going to be starting shooting flash for certain things for birds, okay. We're not going to go into controlling flashes right now. Metering mode I have set to evaluative metering. A lot of times you'll see, if you've watched any of my other videos, I have it set to spot metering. Not because I want to use spot metering, but more because if you go to spot metering and then you go, it puts that circle in the middle of your field of view there, in the middle of your frame, and that stays there and doesn't move with things like tracking that might move all around the frame. So it keeps a reference point in there for me as I'm shooting birds to where the center of the frame is. It's kind of neat. I know that's a kind of one way to do it. You could turn on grids and all that kind of stuff, but that adds too much garbage to the view for me. So I like to just have that circle there if I need it. I needed it a lot more early on when we started with these tracking autofocus points and stuff and things moving all around the frame and not staying centered. I've gotten used to it now, so having a metering mode set to spot isn't so important to me anymore. And you say, well, don't you want metering so you get your exposure right? Well, no, because I really don't use the camera's meter to set my exposure. I shoot manual exposure, and now with exposure simulation, where you can actually see your exposure in the viewfinder, I use that. I look at my scene and my subject for the most part, and I set my exposure based on that. So my meter doesn't do anything anyway. I may use the meter as a relative gauge to a correct exposure for a subject in a certain light conditions, but generally speaking, the meter doesn't do anything. So I can set my metering mode to whatever I want, unless I'm going to use some other aspect of the camera that would make me or require the use of a certain metering mode. And that's the next thing down here, this detect priority auto exposure, automatic exposure while autofocusing is something that it's new. And if you read what Canon says it does, it makes you think that it will meter off your autofocus point or off the autofocus area you're using. And if it's small enough and it encompasses most of the bird, it should be the bird and give you great bird exposures, great subject exposures all the time. I've messed with this. You can see it's grayed out right now, but if I go up here and go to evaluative metering, now it's active and I can turn it on if I want. So that's one of those things I just talked about. So that's why I had evaluative metering turned on in the first place, was because I was messing around with detect priority, automatic exposure while autofocusing to see if it would work for my bird photography, and it didn't really see it helping much. So I don't think that's why it's off. So I'm going to leave it off for now, and I might mess with it some more in the future. But hey, go ahead and mess around with this and see if you can get it to work for your birds and give you consistent exposures on your birds, and lots of different lighting scenarios, picking maybe a small zone or something like that. I'm going to mess with it some more, but I don't think it's really going to work very well. I'd rather just rely on my own manual settings for the bird and the light that I want it in and go from there. Next, picture style. This doesn't affect your raw images. If you're shooting RAW or CRAW, these settings here don't really affect much because you're getting all the raw data and you're going to be doing your post-processing, and that's how you're going to sharpen and all that kind of stuff. But this does, of course, affect JPEGs and HEIFF files, so you may want to mess with this. Right now I have it set to fine detail, and the color space is Adobe RGB because, of course, that's the widest color gamut. Whoops. Right here, and you could do sRGB if you wanted. And again, if you're going to put something on the web right away from in the field, you probably want sRGB encoded into your JPEG file so that it'll look good on the web and stuff like that. So it really depends on what you're doing. I just have it set to an Adobe RGB because it's the widest color gamut that's available on the camera. And if I need a JPEG, it's more than likely I'm going to want it to be encoded with the highest color or widest color gamut. So I just leave it that way. Clarity I keep at the default. Moving on down to high dynamic range, that's off for birds. A lot of these things that I don't need to have on, I keep off because I just think it's adding more to the processing of the camera, what the camera has to process. It's a computer, it only has so much processing power. So I have never found a need for auto lighting optimizers or highlight tone priorities. I don't want things I don't want the camera to prioritize the highlights of my images necessarily over the shadows and things like that. Maybe in your shooting for birds in flight, you want to do that. That's fine. I don't really see the need to prioritize those types of things. So I keep this stuff turned off. White balance. I don't shoot auto white balance. Go in here, of course it's in there. I shoot a Kelvin value of around 6200 to 6500 because I don't want the camera changing white balance on images as I shoot a burst, let's say of many, up to 60, 70, 80, 90 images in a row. If it changes the white balance in there, I don't know, it may add another step to your processing workflow if you have to keep adjusting auto white balance is changing and maybe making changes that aren't so appropriate. And so I found that by shooting a Kelvin value, everything's pretty consistent. It works into my post-processing workflow better. So I keep it at about 62 to 6500. Custom white balance and all this kind of stuff, moving down through the white balance stuff, I don't touch that. That's default. Lens aberration correction, all these things that you can change on your lenses. I've got my 16 to 35 adapted onto this camera just because it's small, and so I can keep it on the desk next to me while I'm making this video. But you can change this for a lot of different things, for a lot of different lenses. I like to do this kind of stuff in post-processing rather than in the camera. I get confused these days real easily. I'm getting older, my brain doesn't work as well. I don't want to double up doing things, doing it in camera and also in post-processing, or not doing it at all because I thought I did it in camera, but I did that kind of stuff. I just keep this stuff turned off in the camera, and I do it in post-processing, and that way I can keep things straight. I know what's happening. And I can see the results better in post-processing too. Long exposure noise reduction, well, that's turned off because we're not generally doing really long exposures for birds. High ISO speed noise reduction. Yeah, we do shoot some high ISO sometimes, and I've always just kept it at the default level. It seems to work fine. I don't see any real bad things happening to my birds, feather detail being destroyed or anything like that. So I'm keeping it that way. Dust delete data, that's not really applicable here. If you want to have the camera identify the dust on your sensor and get rid of it. That's really more important for things where you're stopping down like the F-22 and you see every little spot on your sensor and stuff like that. For birds, when we're shooting these higher, these wider, more wide open apertures, it's not a big deal generally, and so we don't see every spot on the sensor of dust, and even if we do, they're pretty much out of focus and easy to deal with in post-processing. So I don't deal with dust delete data. Multiple exposures, focus bracketing, not applicable for me for my bird photography. Drive mode is. Drive mode's really important, and it's really cool on this camera, the R5 Mark II, because now these drive mode settings apply to both the electronic shutter and the mechanical shutter. In the R5, it only applied to the mechanical shutter, and in the R5 you had 20 frames per second, or you had one shot when you were in the electronic shutter. Now you have multiple drive modes that you can pick from, and we'll get to it in a minute. You can change what H plus means, what H means, and what low means for frames per second. So a lot more flexibility here, which is awesome. Generally, don't change the drive mode here in the menu, the main menu. You have a button set up for that. In this case, I do it via the multifunction button right up there, that little button by your shutter button. And that's really cool the way it works on the R5 Mark II, because you can toggle through these. This used to be done by the Q button, but now right up here with the multifunction button, you can deal with changing your drive mode and a lot of other settings. So I think that's really cool. Pre-shooting, pre-capture, if you want to call it that. I have it enabled. It works great. And it's much nicer because if you're shooting RAW or CRAW, it captures RAW or CRAW. It's not restricted to JPEGs, and it just adds those pre-captured images into your burst of images that you take once you start shooting on your own. Once you go to full press of the shutter button and start taking images. You initialize pre-capture by half pressing the shutter button. And that's kind of the toggle. I've had several people comment that it would be nice if you could assign a button to enable and disable pre-capture. Well, I felt that way too at first, but now, because the toggle is basically half pressing or not half pressing starts it, letting go stops it, and I shoot back button autofocus. So it really works pretty well. I can be focusing on the bird that's going to take off like an owl, and then half press when I think it's going to take off soon. It's going to be pre-capturing, and then once it does take off, I start shooting the burst as it flies towards me or whatever, and you record those pre-captured 30 seconds of frames prior to you actually fully pressing the shutter button to start taking pictures. And so once you get used to this, it's really kind of a built-in toggle anyway. So having a button assignable to this function really isn't necessary. It just takes a little time to get used to how the dynamic of it works. And for me, I like it the way it is. If we go down to interval timer, bulb timer, nothing that really applies to bird photography. Silent shutter function is turned off. Shoot electronic shutter, now you have a volume. We'll get to that. For a fake shutter noise, which is a big improvement over the R5, which did not have that. Shutter mode, electronic shutter. I think I'm going to be shooting electronic shutter all the time because the rolling shutter is much better controlled in the R5 II than it was in the R5. I've got people talking to me now and commenting in my videos saying, hey, I'm shooting hummingbirds in the electronic shutter and I'm not seeing any rolling shutter effects at all in their wings and things. Hey, if you're not seeing it in the wings of hummingbirds, I think you're pretty good. I think we're pretty good here. So it's great out here because, again, I've got pre-continuous shooting or pre-capture turned on, and you have to be an electronic shutter for that. If you go up and you turn this off, now I can change, whoop, boy, I'm doing that a lot. Now I can change the shutter mode to mechanical or electronic first curtain or whatever I want, but I want my pre-shooting on, and so you have to be an electronic shutter. But the electronic shutter looks like it's going to be pretty much the way to go for birds and birds in flight, at least for me. Release the shutter without the card. I have that turned off just for safety reasons, if you want to call it safety. And next tab over, image stabilization mode is grayed out because pre-continuous shooting is on and you're not going to be stabilizing. It really has to do with the lens that's attached to the camera at the time. If you have a lens with image stabilization attached to the camera, then the control of this image stabilization is via the switch on the lens. If you would attach a lens that does not have IS built into it to the camera, this then would not be grayed out, and you could control the IBIS in the camera via this menu item right here. You can customize your quick controls. That's your Q button. I'm not going to go into that. Personal preference, what you put into your quick control menu. Metering, timer, personal preference, how long do you want the meter to be running once you initialize it with half press of the shutter button or however you initialize it. Image review. This can be kind of important. Why? Because of that second item, finder display. I don't want to shoot a burst and then have the last image pop up in my display for a certain amount of time, 4 seconds in this case, because that interrupts me maybe shooting right away again if I have to. You shoot a burst and you let go, and you shoot. You're bursting, right? Burst, 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 burst. Not just one continual burst. Well, in between each one of those bursts, you're going to have an image pop up for 4 seconds. That doesn't work. So, viewfinder display, image review disabled. High speed display is grayed out. Why? Because that applies to mechanical shutter only, and only when you have mechanical shutter set to a lower frame rate speed. So when the drive mode is set to a slow frame rate, setting high speed display, turning that on, will help with the weird behavior and look of the viewfinder, kind of laggy if you want to call it that, at those lower frames per second speeds, and it will help you be able to track faster moving subjects better when you're in those settings of mechanical shutter at slower frames per second. But because we are in a drive mode of H+, and we have got pre-continuous shooting and stuff on, this thing isn't available to us. Blackout free display. So what does that do then? Well, I don't see that it does a whole lot. It's only for the electronic shutter. And to be honest, when I turn it on and turn it off, all I see, the only difference I see in the viewfinder behavior is that when you first start taking a burst of shots, if this is turned off the way it is now, you'll see a little bit of a black screen for just like it's so fast it doesn't even matter. And then you're on to shooting and you can track and shoot moving subjects no problem. If you turn this on, that little blackout goes away, and maybe that's a big deal to some people. I just didn't see a whole big deal about this. And the thing about turning blackout free display on is, notice down here, the next item down, display simulation, it's depth of field and exposure simulation. If you turn this off, it's just exposure simulation, and that's really what I want for my display simulation. I don't want depth of field and exposure. So for me, I'm keeping blackout free display off for now. Hey, give this a try, turning it on, turning it off, and let me know what you think. If you're seeing something that's really important here with this setting, let me know in the comments section of this video. Optical viewfinder simulation view assist. Woo, some of these things, yeah, but hey, they're trying to make it apparent what these different settings are for. This is going to simulate an optical viewfinder. So when you look through your viewfinder, it's going to show you the ambient light out there. It's not going to show you a simulation of your exposure that you have set. Why would you want to do that? Well, if it's really dark and you're shooting a darker exposure, maybe it's hard to see things. I don't know. I like seeing my exposure simulation, but One thing about turning this on, I have turned it on and off and looked at different things, especially with mechanical shutter and the behavior of the viewfinder when I'm trying to track fast-moving subjects, flying birds, is that turning this on and actually not having the simulation of your exposure seems to make the behavior of the viewfinder more like when you're shooting electronic shutter, that is easier to track faster moving subjects. Now, I'm not totally convinced of this yet, but it seems to help a little. So try it. But that's a big sacrifice to make in my mind, losing exposure simulation to get better performance mechanical shutter when I'm not going to be shooting mechanical shutter probably that much anyway, if at all, giving the performance of the electronic shutter now in the R5 Mark II. Going on down the line, we've got high HDR shooting and C-Log, view assist. All this does is it simulates better what a high dynamic range image will look like on your TV or something like that on the display, either the LCD or your viewfinder. So not a big deal. Shooting information display, there's a lot of stuff in here. A lot of this is so much just personal preference. Go through it, change it how you want it, whatever. Go down to histogram display. Brightness, but I like it to be small. I don't want a bunch of big things cluttering up my view because I'm trying to track fast-moving birds a lot. Same with if I have the electronic level in there, I want it to be small. I don't want it to be big. Hey, one cool thing is this card, Free Space, now you can have it show a percentage. I turned that on. I like that much better than the number of shots that are left, because that can be very variable. So there you go. I'm not going to go into all this stuff in real detail in this shooting information display because, again, a lot of it is just personal preference and how you like to shoot. It doesn't really affect how well you can do things when it comes to bird photography or bird and flight photography. This one is important. Display frame rate set. Smooth. It increases the refresh rate of your viewfinder, making it easier, smoother looking when you're tracking fast-moving subjects. Viewfinder display format, that or that, whatever you want to do. Doesn't seem to matter much at all in actually capturing the images you're trying to capture. Reversing the display, that's if you flip your LCD screen around, it still keeps everything looking good and all that kind of stuff. So that's it for the shoot menu. Now we move on to what most people think, I guess, is the most important menu, and that's autofocus in these cameras. And we've got a lot of the same things, but I will tell you right now that I think the R5 Mark II's autofocus is the most refined autofocus for capturing very quick action, like birds in flight, of any camera I've used. It's even better than the R3 in some respects, and we'll talk a little bit about that as I go through more of the menu items here with the autofocus menu. Servo autofocus, of course, especially if you're using back button. It's like having one-shot autofocus and servo at the same time, because it's not going to be servoing unless you have a button pressed. Servo autofocus, autofocus area, is not something that you generally set here in the menu. Again, it is probably better set here, right? So you can go over here, multifunction button, and then you're going to go to here and you can change whichever autofocus area you want to shoot, and then back on out of there, or what? There we go. And set it that way. Though you'll see if I go into the autofocus area menu, I've got it set up for potentially having different autofocus areas for the different orientations of the camera. Landscape versus portrait, either way. For landscape, I have it, just for example, set to number 1 flexible zone, and for the other two, I have it to number 2 flexible zone. So you can do it differently for the different orientations of your camera if you want to do it that way. Whole area tracking servo autofocus. I have that turned off. Again, you generally don't turn that on and off via the main menu. I have a button set up for that on my camera, and that is the set button on my R5 Mark II, so I can toggle whole area tracking on and off if I want, very easily by just pressing the set button. Focus mode is grayed out. That's because I have a lens attached to the camera that actually has a manual focus and autofocus switch on it. So that's how you're going to control your focus mode. If you have a lens attached to the camera that's viable as far as communicating with the camera, and it does not have a focus mode switch, then you might be able to control manual versus autofocus via this menu item right here. Subject to detect, of course, for birds is going to be animals. Now, eye detection. This is interesting. We have an auto added in here on the Canon R5 Mark II, along with a right and left eye setting. Well, guess what? For my birds, I don't care which eye it picks. If I want eye focus on and I want it to grab an eye, I don't care which one it is. Just grab the eye that it can grab and I'm going to be good. But the auto part of this is interesting, and I've been shooting it in auto. And I'm pretty sure that this helps when it comes to whether an eye is detectable or not on your subject, and it's switching automatically the algorithms that are being used for autofocus on your subject. So for example, if I have this set to auto and I'm using the zone that I'm talking about here, a flexible zone, and the eye is available, it's going to use that, and it's going to use eye detection, and it's going to focus on the eye if it can. But if there's no eye apparent, it's going to switch algorithms and go more to what I would call a pure zone and look for movement and flight, wings going up and down and all that kind of stuff. So I think this is a much more flexible way to implement eye detection in the autofocus system. This is one of the refinements that I've been talking about, and I like the behavior of it, shooting with a zone with eye detection set to auto. So there you go. I don't know. Let me see, let me know what you think about these settings as you're playing around with them. This is what I've figured out and what I've got set, and it's been working really well for me to this point. Register people priority is not a priority because we're shooting birds, and birds aren't people, obviously. So we're not going to go into that. We're also not going to go into action priority because that is for sports. Subject to detect is animals. It has to be people. Whoops. I'm doing this all the time. So if we go up to people, and then now it's there. And now we can set a sporting event, soccer, basketball, volleyball, and register people and set action priority, all this kind of stuff. But we're not doing that. But it's neat that it's in there. Those of you who shoot sports, hey, let me know how it works. Maybe I'll start shooting sports someday, and you can educate me on how this stuff works. No more autofocus cases, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. Now we have auto and manual. I'm going to be doing another video just on the autofocus of this camera, and we'll talk more about all these things and the behavior and stuff in much more detail there. But here you have now two choices, auto and manual. And if you're in manual, you have two different parameters you can set, tracking sensitivity and XL decel tracking, and you can see I have set them to the default setting. I haven't changed them because I am using auto. Ever since auto case came to the R5, the R3, and now it's in the R5 Mark II, I shoot auto, but this is another refinement in the R5 Mark II over the R5 and the R3 is you can change how this auto case, the characteristics of it in the sense of, if you hit the rate button, how it performs, locked on versus responsive, I have it on locked on, because when it grabs my subject, and it is grabbing my subject almost all the time, I want it to stay on that subject. I don't want it to switch. I don't want it to lose it. And this is another refinement. It seems to be working really, really well and much better at holding on to a subject, even when things come into the frame that are going to compete, even when the bird disappears for a split second, it's holding on to the bird. It's not refocusing on these other things like trees in the foreground or background. Here's a GIF of I don't know how many images, 80 some images. You can see an owl flying. It disappears, but the autofocus doesn't refocus. This is a refinement. I think this is part of it. It is really good. Better than the R3, much better than the R5. So, I have it set to auto, case auto characteristics, the characteristic of how it acts when you're in the case set to auto is on lockdown, or the negative setting. First image priority for servo autofocus I have set to release. You can have it released, you can have it equal priority, or you can have it focus. I definitely don't want it on focus. I hate the way it behaves that way. If you try to shoot and the camera thinks your subject isn't in focus, it won't shoot. That completely throws me off. When I press the shutter button all the way down, I want the camera to start shooting. I don't care if it thinks if the subject's in focus or not. So that's my setting. One shot, I never shoot in one shot for the most part, so I'm not worried about that. Preview autofocus. That should say continuous autofocus, like it does for video shooting. If you turn this on, if you enable it, that's the only other option, your camera and lens are going to focus continuously. And I don't want that. So that is disabled. If you have a scenario that you're shooting in for birds and you need it to be focusing all the time, even when you're not pressing any buttons to make it autofocus, then turn this on. But I haven't come across a scenario like that. Lens drive when autofocus is impossible, turn that on. That's so it cycles. This camera cycles more, kind of like a digital SLR in a way. It's not getting stuck on the background or the foreground elements as much, and then not refocusing again when you hit the whatever initiation button you hit, half press or a back button. It seems to be another refinement. It's doing better. It's not exactly like a digital SLR was or is, but it's better. Lens drive when autofocus impossible is turned on. Don't worry about autofocus assist beam firing here for birds. Limit your autofocus areas. I did. Some of these I don't use. I'll talk about this when I do my autofocus video. But these locked autofocus areas, that's just a quick way to go to an autofocus area, spot, one point, or the one point with surround points around it, that is fixed. No tracking throughout the frame, no subject to detect defined. That's what these are. And you can go to them directly, and you can set them to a button directly if you want. I don't really see a need for them because I can turn my tracking on and off with a button, the set button, like I said, and I can use the top ones that aren't locked, kind of in the same way. So I'm not big into using those yet. Maybe I'll find a reason to use them in the future, but they're there. Another refinement. Orientation linked autofocus. This is where you turn on, when you went back to the autofocus area, the first menu there you saw we had the landscape and the portrait orientation of the camera, and you could pick different autofocus areas for those orientations. This is where you set being able to do that. If you do same for both vertical and horizontal, if we go up there and pick that instead, and then we go back here, now you'll see that those orientations are gone and you just have the autofocus area there to pick from. So if that's what you want, then you can get that. But I want it separate. So then you go back, and now it looks the way it did when we first went in there, and you can set different autofocus areas for the different orientations of the camera. So that's the way, ooh, I knew I was going to do that. So that's how you deal with that. Limit subjects to detect. I've got some things limited. I've got people and animals, and that's it. I'm not doing cars, I'm not doing auto this or auto that. Just give me 2 things to pick from. I like limiting things when I can. Left and right eye detection. You know what? I don't know. Just give me an eye, like I said before. Auto, eye detection, that's what I'm using now. I just left them all on. Because I'm not quite sure how I'm going to use all that. It's too early on in using the camera. Manual focus stuff, peaking is turned on, focus guide is on. In case I get into manual focusing situations, I do still get into those sometimes. And I like the guides to be there to help me make sure that my subject is in focus. This is new. Register and recall autofocus related settings. Hey, you can set up your autofocus. All these things we've been talking about here. And then you can register them. Like I did one for just to try it as an example, and I called it my initials, RRB, and then default, DEF, or default autofocus settings, and registered those. And you can change them all around a bunch of times and record each one of your settings and recall them at will for different shooting scenarios and stuff like that. So that's pretty cool. Recall them just by going here. Yeah. All right. So that's a refinement, something added to the autofocus. Canon's done a lot of work on the autofocus for us, and it shows. Especially when you're really shooting in demanding scenarios like really fast reaction birds in flight and stuff like that. You will see that this camera is the most refined and most capable autofocus system so far by Canon. It outdoes the R3 in certain ways. Don't get me wrong, the R3 is great. The R5 was great in its time. But this camera moves forward in the autofocus realm, there's no doubt. All right. So, moving on to the playback menu, there's not a whole lot to go into in here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. This video gets long enough as it is. So, there's a couple things. I mean, if you want to try in-camera upscaling and stuff, it's not going to work. I don't have a card in here. But even if I did, it'd be all raw images, and it doesn't work on raw images. It's only for JPEGs and HEIFs, I think, or however you pronounce that word. So you can mess around with that stuff if you want. It's not going to be something that I'm going to do, especially on this camera. That's already 45 megapixels. Maybe on the R1 when you're shooting 24, but then you got to shoot JPEGs again, I think, and limitations. Slideshow, virtual reality, identifying out of focus images and stuff. No, thank you. I'll do that myself. Last menu tab, highlight alert. I don't mind seeing my blinkies when I review. Autofocus point display, I used to turn that on, but now I'm turning it off because it just adds clutter in there when I'm looking at my image. And you know what? It used to be, way back when, that you were looking to see if your image was, if your subject was sharp, if autofocus got the bird. Now, if it misses, is really the, almost every image now is sharp on the subject. If you did a decent job, the camera's autofocus is not, it's just unbelievably good. So I'm keeping that turned off. I don't care where it grabbed the bird for the most part. And a lot of times it's lags behind anyway. Playback grid, I don't care about grids and stuff when I'm just reviewing images really quickly in the field. Network settings, connectivity menu, and I'm not setting any of this stuff up right now. I'm not going to take the time in this video to go over this stuff. If you want to connect your phone or a wireless remote, you want to deal with this kind of stuff, then have at it. This is all personal stuff. Doesn't really affect getting pictures of birds and birds in flight unless you're going to start doing some remote work with your camera. GPS device, you can connect one and do all the settings in this menu right here. Moving on to the setup menu, that's what it used to be called, the yellow wrench menu. And up top. How do I have that set up for recording my images into the different cards and folders and stuff? Separate? No, for video and stills, because I shoot both and I want them both going to the fastest card, and that's the Compact Flash Express card, so they are not separated. That's just disabled. Recording for stills is auto switch card, so if I do fill up my card, my Compact Flash Express card, it will roll over automatically to my SD card, and that way I don't miss great action, because you know when your card generally fills up, it's when the best action ever is happening. So I use auto switch card. I'm not a wedding photographer. I don't need to do active backup in the field. I've never had a card fail. That may happen someday, but I've never had it happen to me yet, so there we go. Maybe I'm running on borrowed time. I don't know. Recording options for video is standard, okay? I'm not going to switch cards with video because the video settings I use require write speeds that only the Compact Flash Express card can handle sometimes. So it's just on standard, and it's going to go to the main card that I have selected. And that's about all we really need to talk about in here. All this stuff, file numbering, clip number, rotating, format card. Here's the one menu item that I put in my menu, which is the very last menu, because I want to get the format card quickly and I don't have to dive into deep into the menus to do that. Nothing else really going on there. Set up your date, time, frequency. Beep. Thank you. Because you enable that and then you go into the volume and there's your shutter volume for your electronic shutter, your fake shutter noise for the electronic shutter, and that is something that the R5 didn't have, never had, maybe never will, and I hated that, and now we've got it. I've got it tuned down just one level from the default, so it's nice and quiet. I can hear it. Most people shooting next to me can't even hear it, but I can hear it, and that's important to me. The rest of this is turned down because I don't want to hear focus beeps and all that kind of stuff, because that is bloody annoying. And it's not even just annoying to me shooting, but to people around you it can be really annoying. So anyway, that's a cool addition, something that should have happened to the R5, never did, but we've got it in the R5 Mark II. Screen brightness I have set pretty high, almost to the highest brightness, because when I use my LCD screen, it's usually in bright sunny conditions, and if you're going to see anything on your LCD screen, you have to have the brightness set pretty high or you won't see anything at all. Viewfinder brightness, however, is really important because that's how I set my exposures, like I said earlier, and having it set to auto is pretty good. Canon does a good job, and it keeps things pretty accurate looking through the viewfinder with ambient light conditions, keeping the exposure simulation looking pretty close to what your actual exposure is. And so that's what I have it set to, auto. Screen viewfinder color tone and refining your color tone, I don't care about this stuff, never have had to mess with any of that kind of stuff. The rest of this down here that I'm going back and forth on doesn't have anything to do with anything that we're really worried about right now with the camera setup, so we're going to move on. Shutter at shutdown, I want it down, protect the sensor, keep it cleaner. Power saving, screen dim after 20 seconds. Power off of the camera though, I've set for a pretty long period, 5 minutes. I just don't want it shutting down every minute and having to wake it up all the time. Just adds a little wake up split second to when you want to start shooting again. I'd rather keep it a little longer, like at 5 minutes. Viewfinder off, I have disabled. So there you go. Custom modes, C1, C2, C3. We're not going to reset the camera, obviously. I use C1, C2, C3. C1's for bird photography, C2 for landscapes, C3 for astrophotography, because each one of those genres of photography incorporate a lot of changes to a lot of menus between those, and that saves me a ton of time. I don't use C1, C2, C3 for like still birds for C1, birds in flight C2, because all you're really changing there is something like shutter speed and things like that. So that's how I use C1, C2, C3. So when you get done with this video and you have your R5 Mark II set up for bird photography, why not save all those settings to C1? So you go in here and you go to register settings and you go to custom shooting C1 and you hit save, and then you can recall them as a shooting mode later on. Battery information. This is kind of cool. It tells you how many shots you've taken on each battery, how much power is left on each battery, recharge performance of your batteries. You got to register them first before you get these data coming in, but it's pretty cool stuff. I like it. Firmware, blah, 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 blah. Okay, into the home stretch. A brand new menu in the Canon R5 Mark II is the customized controls menu, kind of separated out from the custom functions menu, which they still have. But this new menu starts out with customize buttons for shooting. Definitely want to do that. Set up the Canon R5 Mark II just like I set up my R5 and my R3 for the most part. Few differences. Half press of the shutter button. Metering start. That's it. No autofocus initiation. I shoot back button autofocus. The movie record button, that red button on the top of the camera there by the, I guess the on-off switch is the best landmark. I don't use that button, but I'm leaving it to start and stop movie recording just like it's set for default. You go down to the multifunction button, and we already kind of went into that. It's a dial function button. Now you can use it as a toggle to go through different settings in here. So if you want to do drive mode like we did just a little while ago, you can get to that, and then you can use your main dial to scroll through the drive modes, or you can use your thumb wheel to do the different autofocus main methods like one shot, AI focus, or servo. Of course, we want servo. And then we can just get out of there and back into a menu. Back into the custom. That's the multifunction button. So I left that as the default. I like it that way on this camera. The mode button is the mode button. That's how you get into manual versus shutter priority versus aperture priority kind of thing. C1, C2, C3. Here's the big one for back button autofocus users like me. Autofocus on, I have set to metering and autofocus start. And that, then, when I press the autofocus on button, will use the main autofocus method that I have set up in the autofocus area section of the autofocus menu. The second button over, the asterisk button, I have set as a direct link to eye detection autofocus. And then last button on the very right, your autofocus point button, I have set to use register and recall a shooting function. And once you're in that, once you have that button set up for register and recall a shooting function, you can hit the info button and you can get into the detail set for that function. And you can check mark any one of these that you want. And if there's a check mark in there and whatever then you have set up for that parameter, it will use when you press and hold that button, which in this case is the autofocus point button. You can notice here that I have everything unchecked except for autofocus area, which I have set to spot, and all the way down at the bottom pretty much, autofocus operation set to on. So that means when I hit the far right back button, I get spot autofocus. When I hit the asterisk button, I get my eye detection. You can't see it because there's no eye to detect, but you can see the brackets go away. So it's using the entire frame to look for an eye. And then if I hit my autofocus on button, it's going to use the zone there that you see in the frame. So that's how I have my main autofocus button set up, the back button autofocus on my camera. If we keep moving down, though, there's some more buttons in here. Depth of field preview button, the button on the front of the camera. I have that set to switch continuous shooting modes. The set button, like I said earlier, I have it as a toggle to start and stop whole area autofocus. So if I'm in spot and I want to go to tracking from there, all I have to do is hit the set button and I'm in tracking. And then I have the multi-controller, a little thumb joystick there, set up to directly control my autofocus point, moving around within the frame. And if you press it straight in, it centers it. And there's a spot, little dot there that comes up in the very center of the frame telling you that you do have your autofocus area centered in the frame. I like that addition. That came along in the R3, and that's a really cool addition, making sure you know if it's, because I move it over just a little bit, it goes away. Move it back, it comes out. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Back into the buttons. What else we got here? Nothing else that really matters. I'm not going to take the time to go into all this stuff. That doesn't really matter for setting up for bird photography. Not going into the video side of things. Again, that's a whole nother video. How about customizing the dials and control ring? Pretty much set up like a lot of you probably have your R5 or R3 or R7 set up. Main dial, that's shutter speed. Secondary dial, dial 2 they call it, that's for ISO on my camera. And then the thumb wheel is for aperture. And I have the control ring, so if I have a lens with a control ring on it attached to my camera, attached to my R5 Mark II, it's going to give me a quick way to select autofocus area. So it never hurts to have more than one way to do certain things, depending on the setup that you're using when you're shooting. Now, the rest of this stuff in here, pretty much, it's all personal preference. Set it up the way you like it. Moving down one notch in this menu, if you want to turn touch and drag autofocus stuff on for your viewfinder, not your viewfinder, your LCD screen, go for it. Like I just mentioned, autofocus area selection controls with the multifunction button, that little button up by the shutter button. That works well. I like the dial function controls there. It's a pretty quick way to get at a lot of different things, just kind of like the Q button, but it's easier than the Q button because I know exactly where it is. I can keep my eye pretty much in the viewfinder and make these changes with that little button up there. All the rest of this stuff, personal preference. Set it up the way you like it. They even have a customized buttons for playback now. If that's important to you, go in here and you can set these things up for memo recording and rating your pictures and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into that stuff. It's not all that important at all critical to taking good bird and flight images. Image jumps using your different dials and all that kind of stuff. Again, do you want it to jump 1? Do you want it to jump 10? Do you want it to go to a group? If you're grouping your images, that's all set up here. Eye control, I have it turned off. Does it work? Yeah, I have an R3. I set it up on the R3. It kind of works. But for birds, I just never found it to be very useful. Same thing here in the R5 Mark II. I think it's a little more refined. You might have trouble calibrating it if you wear glasses and you're not good at getting your eye up to the viewfinder the exact same way with your glasses on. So then the control might not be as precise as you'd like it to be or as accurate as you'd like it to be. But I just don't think it is a big deal for bird photography because we use such long focal lengths. And so our field of view is so small that it's almost easier it's just easier to move your bird's head or whatever, that bird your subject that you want to focus on, to the center of the frame and hit one of your back buttons to get autofocus on your subject, rather than having to look at it and then hit the button and hope that the target goes exactly where you want it to go. I don't know. Leave your comments down below about eye control and if you found it at all useful for bird photography. I haven't, so it stays turned off right now. Touch control, all that stuff, default. Now onto the custom functions menu, which is still in existence, but with most of the important stuff really taken out of it. For what we do, the setup that we want to do for birds, well, let's see, let's go through these things. Restrict shooting modes. Yeah, I do have restricted shooting modes. I don't want FV, and I want A+, and I want P. I kept the ones active that I'm going to use. You can hit Q button and do a bunch of detail setting in here. Exposure levels, pretty much standard stuff. Speed, from metering and ISO auto. What the heck does that mean, right? Well, this is what it means. If you shoot auto ISO and you go off of auto, let's say you manually change it to 800 ISO for some reason, and you have it set the way I do, the blue highlighted one there, restore auto after metering. Once the metering times out from that shooting session that you just did, after you changed your ISO to 800, for example, it will automatically roll back to auto ISO. If you pick this option instead, it will not. It will stay at ISO 800 after your shooting session, and the metering that was started along with the start of that shooting burst or whatever turns off. It will not go back to auto automatically. So that's what that setting is. I don't shoot auto ISO, but if I did find myself in auto ISO, I'd want it to revert back because I was in there for a reason. Just kind of got out of it probably for something that was short-lived, let's say. Bracketing auto cancel, I turn that on because if I do shoot bracketing exposures or whatever, I want it to turn off automatically. I don't want to forget that it's on, and I would forget. Bracketing sequences, set that how you want. The number of bracketed shots, set that how you want if you do that stuff. Safety shift is off. Same exposure for new aperture. A lot of us shoot variable aperture zoom lenses. And that means you may be shooting manual exposure and have your exposure set just right, or even in, exposure compensation, and then you zoom in and out and your aperture is changing and you don't then want your exposure to change. You've got it correct. So if you set this to ISO instead of just disabling it, it will automatically change the ISO to keep your exposure the same as your aperture changes as you zoom in and out. I think this is a great feature, and I have it set to ISO and I leave it there. And it works really, really well when I'm shooting my 200 to 800, for example. AE lock meter mode off after, okay, whatever. I'm not gonna, this stuff is, shutter speed ranges, set aperture range, all this stuff. Go into it if you want to. I don't put ranges in there. I just leave things at the default. I want them all available to me if I need them. Continuous shooting speed. This is a fun one. This is new, having to do with the H+ and H and low speed frames per second being available in electronic shutter in this camera compared to it not being available in the R5. You could even do this in the R3, where you can set the frames per second for these different levels of drive mode. High speed plus, H+, or H, high speed, and then low. And I have it 30, 20, and 10. Now, this would seem real. If you hit the info button, it seems straightforward. For any one of those drive modes, H+, H, or low, you can have any of those speeds set. Well, yes and no. For example, you can't have high H+ set to 20 and also have H set to 20, and then they're interrelated. What you can set one level to has to do with what you have another level set to. And so let's get out of here and I'll kind of show you what I mean. If I would set H+ right now to something other than 30, it won't even let me. You notice those two arrows on the right-hand side that popped up are grayed out. Why is that? Well, because I have high speed. Let's get out of here. Oops, I hit the wrong button. If I go down to high speed and I change this, let's say, to 15 instead of 20, and then go to high speed continuous, oh, look what happens. The down arrow on the right is lit up now, and I can change that to 20. I couldn't do that with high speed set to 20 because the next step down for H plus was 20 and high speed was already set to 20. You kind of get it? So these are they depend on each other and their settings to what you can set each one to be. So I'm not going to go into this any further, just to know that you can't set them all to whatever you want. You've got to take into account what you have the other one set to first. So I'm going to go back and put this back to 30, come down to high speed, put that to 20, and leave my low speed at 10. So now I can go 30, 20, 10 if I want. Hey, if I want to go to low speed, I can go up, but I can't go to 20 because high speed's at 20. You get it. I can go down to 7.5 or 5 if I want. I'm going to keep it at 10. So there you go. That's a neat thing to be able to do. It only applies to electronic shutter. Okay, that's it. Doesn't apply to mechanical shutter. Limit continuous shot count. I don't want to limit it, so I don't. I want to shoot as many as I can until the buffer fills sometimes. And it will fill at 30 frames per second on this camera if you shoot 99 shots in a row or something like that. It's a lot, and it's a good buffer, I think, for this camera. Next menu over in the custom functions menu. Whew, I keep doing that. Add cropping information, AV settings without lens, all this stuff. Set it up the way you want it. Doesn't have much bearing on shooting birds in flight efficiently or well. The last menu, my menu. The only thing I have in there right now is format card, like I said earlier, and I have that set up that way in all my cameras so I can get at formatting my cards quickly. But I don't really put much else in here. You can do a lot with my menu or you can do very little like I do. That's up to you. So there you have it. There's my look at the menus so far of the R5 Mark II set up for my bird photography. Birds and a lot of birds in flight. So we'll get out of the menus and we're going to finish up this video. Well, there you have it. My first deep dive into the menu system of the Canon R5 Mark II for birds and birds in flight. I hope you found something in there that might help you set up your camera better and get you better results in your bird photography. If you did, hey, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. Turn on notifications, that's always a good idea. I'll be doing more videos on the Canon R5 Mark II really soon, and you'll know when they come out if you do that. So hey, thanks for watching. I hope you have great light. I hope you're getting great images. Be safe out there. I'll see you soon.